Hello and welcome to the May 31st edition of Ukraine Without Hype. I am Anthony Bardaway. Now, as those on the Discord are aware, I am currently on the road right now. I'm in Romania. I'm doing some of my residency paperwork. Part of that process requires going outside the country to a Ukrainian embassy, so I came to Bucharest to do that. I suppose that's worth a news update of some kind regarding Bucharest, which is that despite some concerns that the failed presidential candidate Simeon would cause more of a ruckus than he has, the political mood around here seems pretty calm. The far-right forces aren't really doing anything. There was a small protest a few days ago that, very small, basically did nothing, and they're just going on their way. I'm a little jealous of them right now. While I'm sure that the Romanian far-right forces will show their head again at some point, for now, that problem seems to have been defeated. And of course, being outside the country is always a surreal experience. It's only my second time leaving, and it is certainly odd to have quiet nights, especially as I was leaving the country. It was truly a tremendously large series of drone and missile attacks for about 3 nights straight while I was there before I left. So it was not a soft landing to leave the country, to go from all that to nothing. But for this episode, I'm going to step back and look at something that occurred earlier this month, which was the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. Now, I've talked about World War II numerous times on this podcast regarding remembrance and how Russia weaponizes it, but I wanted to, for this occasion, find a way to kind of collect my thoughts. And the best way to do that is to, I suppose, tell my version of the story of the Second World War in Ukraine. Don't worry, this is not going to be a 20-hour-long podcast series. There's plenty of those out there. And this will certainly be more polemical than some of those. But to me, picking a start date of when to tell about World War II, that's always a question mark. The Spanish Civil War was certainly a precursor to the Second World War, and the various Sino-Japanese wars, that was all rolled into World War II. It was truly a collision of multiple different wars that eventually ran into the same stream more than a singular event. But for Ukraine, I think it's best to start in the immediate aftermath of the First World War. Now, the story of the First World War and the ensuing revolutionary period is an epic tale that will have to be told another day, but to just shake it out, how the wars ended, is the word wars plural there, how that period of time ended, with Ukraine split between multiple different countries, or the Ukrainian lands, we can say. The largest portion of which was, of course, under the Soviet Union, under the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. In the west, the regions of Galicia and Volhynia went to Poland. The Second Polish Republic, the Subcarpathian region, Zakarpattia, was a part of Czechoslovakia, while the Bukovina region around Chernivtsi, the city I came into Romania from, was a part of the Kingdom of Romania. And just for completion's sake, Crimea was a part of the Russian Federative Socialist Republic, I believe it was called, despite the attempts by the Crimean Republic to join Ukraine in the revolutionary period. Now, the experiences between these countries was very varied, of course, but we'll especially have to look at the differences between Poland and the Soviet Union. With the Soviet Union, if we look at the 1920s, it was a period of more cultural pluralism, allowing the various constituent nations of the Soviet Union to develop themselves on their own terms to a certain extent. This did not last very long, only a couple years. Through the mid-20s, by 1929 or so, that experiment was over. And with the 30s, we saw the severe repressions by the Soviet state, the most ghastly of which was, of course, in 1933 with the Holodomor and 1932. While with Poland, it was a republican form of government, though it certainly had its own problems with authoritarianism and ultranationalism. In the early phases of the Second Polish Republic, Pilsudski, the dictator, we can call it, of Poland, he was the liberal dictator, I suppose, relied much more on support from the ethnic minority political parties, including the Ukrainian political parties, to support his projects, and so there was more tolerance, more pluralism. But after his death and the ensuing power grabs by the more ultranationalist far right, the tensions between the Polish state and its Ukrainian minority became ever more tense and violent. In coming with the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, the ever-famous aspect of the Second World War in Ukraine that had various parts of it collaborate with the Nazis for various periods of time, while others ended up fighting against the Nazis. Rather complicated, not the level of detail that we'll be going into for this episode, except in the broad strokes of things. But within the Second Polish Republic, the OUN side of things, I suppose, the more radical, sometimes terroristic aspects of the Ukrainian movement was very much a small minority compared to the primarily social democratic and liberal side of the Ukrainian political world that believed more in political processes. Though with the later conquest of Poland by Nazi Germany, the people who believed in political processes kind of lost that argument. But within that world of the Second Polish Republic, these tensions were often because of the fact that there was a plan by Warsaw to Polonize the Ukrainian lands, to convert Ukrainian churches to Polish ones, to settle Polish farmers into Galicia and Volhynia, to make the area more Polish and less Ukrainian, meaning on the dawn of the German invasion, tensions between the Polish and Ukrainian peoples of the Second Polish Republic were quite high, leading to some of the devastating crimes that would happen during the Second World War, when the veneers of political process were worn away and replaced with violence. But it was in this Second Polish Republic that Ukrainians experienced the beginnings of the Second World War. Now, even in Ukraine, beginning of the war is most often, it seems, marked with Operation Barbarossa in 1941, but that wasn't really the case, but rather on September 1st, 1939, where Ukrainians were a part of the Second Polish Republic when Hitler invaded. And I believe this can be where our polemics start, because the reasons that Hitler gave to invade Poland was that he made a bunch of claims about how the German people of Poland were being repressed, and how there was massacres of the German civilians under Polish rule, and how if Germany did not act, they'd be watching massacres of their people. And well, it sounded pretty much identical to what Putin was saying at the beginning of this invasion now, doesn't it? Which is why, as you recall from the Tucker Carlson interview, Putin actually spoke favorably of Germany's rationale behind invading Poland. So Russia, the country that stakes its national legitimacy on defeating the Nazis in World War II, fully agreed with Hitler's reasons for starting it, something that not enough people picked up on, I feel, but that still leaves this gap. What was happening between 1939 and 1941? And to talk about that, we of course have to talk about what led to that moment in the first place, which was the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, when the Soviet Union, Stalin, and Nazi Germany agreed to split Eastern Europe between themselves. And again, echoing this idea of ethnic revanchism and gathering together the ethnic clans of this or that nation, part of the justifications that the Soviet Union gave for this collaboration with Nazi Germany was that they wanted the Belarusian and Ukrainian lands that existed within the Second Polish Republic to be integrated into the Soviet Union, of Lviv becoming a part of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, and the west of Belarus becoming a part of the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic, which creates kind of an awkward moment for modern-day Ukrainians, because this kind of was the unification of Ukraine in a way. We can certainly criticize the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact for many reasons. It was just base imperialism on the part of both Moscow and Berlin. We know what these countries would go on to do, and I'll explain some of it, of course. It's hard, we can't brush over the horrific incidences of slaughter and genocide and tragedy that this agreement led to. But Chernivtsi from Romania, Galicia and Volhynia from Poland were added to Ukraine, and that's how they became a part of Ukraine. So I don't know what to do with that. Consider for yourselves. And within these years, 1939 to 1941, the newly acquired Ukrainian and Belarusian lands, as well as the Baltics that the Soviet Union just invaded, and have their own story to tell. But during this time period, from 39 to 41, one of the main things that happened was just the slaughter of Poles. Now, earlier in the 30s, there had been what was called the Polish operation of the NKVD, where the Soviet secret police killed over 100,000 Polish people throughout the Soviet Union between the years of 1937 and 1938. So the Polish target, I suppose, had already existed when these lands were occupied by the Soviets. And these repressions of Polish people within Galicia and Volhynia were extensive. They were the most targeted group within these areas. While the Ukrainian population, there were certainly some who welcomed the Soviets. There were communists. Many communists in this area were Ukrainian Russophiles who wanted to join their territory to that of the Soviet Union. But also, there were a lot of Ukrainians who had heard the stories of how the Soviet Union worked. They heard and they learned of the Holodomor. And while the civil rights of Ukrainians in the Second Polish Republic were not good, to give a understatement, compare that to Stalin, they saw their quality of life diminish quite quickly. And unlike the rest of Soviet Ukraine, which was able to see a gradual buildup of repressions into the 30s, having peak Stalin violence thrust upon them immediately must have been quite jarring. And so when Germany invaded in 1941 with Operation Barbarossa, it was already a region that was primed to explode. Now, during the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, it was often justified as that it gave the Soviet Union, quote, strategic depth. However, Stalin did not take the opportunity to create new defenses, and in fact, he abandoned old defenses, meaning that this strategic depth lasted about 2 weeks. And with Operation Barbarossa beginning on June 22nd of 1941, the Germans had already captured Kiev by September 26th. And what immediately came after that was the Babin Yar massacre, the mass slaughter of Kiev's Jews. Now, I'm trying not to make this a full-on history podcast, so I'll skip ahead. During the period when the war was being fought over Ukraine, the vast majority of its people supported the Soviet Union. Most of the Ukrainians who fought in that war fought in the ranks of the Red Army. A minority joined with the Germans, and others first joined with the Germans before leaving the Germans and becoming a separate entity, OUN-UPA. But numerically, they were the minority. And this war would go on until 1944 with the Battle of Uzhgorod, happening in October of 1944, and shortly after that, the Germans being fully expelled out of the Ukrainian lands, with the war itself coming to a close in Europe anyway, not to mention Japan, but in Europe anyway, in May of 1945, 80 years ago this month. And really, if we're comparing the Second World War to this one, the obvious comparison is in the buildup. So not only was Hitler making those demands on Poland for the protection of ethnic Germans and all that, but that was really how they made their claims throughout. Of course, the historical unity of Germany and Austria was the immediate unification effort that Hitler undertook, and the level to which the Austrians were okay with it is some historical revisionism to eliminate their role as bad guys, but moving on. But throughout this buildup, before the invasion of Poland, it's almost cliche to point this out, but no retelling of this is complete without it. The concept of appeasement. Throughout Hitler's rise to power, there were so many points where that could have been shut down. There's so many points where if someone had stepped in strongly enough, there wouldn't have been Nazi Germany as we know it. There wouldn't have been the Holocaust. There still would have been a lot of repressions. Certainly that happened before anyone really had a great ability to step in and stop them. But Czechoslovakia, that was just allowed to happen. the European powers just stepped back and said, okay, take Czechoslovakia. Now, to their credit, the Brits thought they weren't able to have the war at that time. Of course, they were just coming off of the First World War, and nobody wanted a repeat of the First World War. So maybe if you just let Hitler do what he wants, he'll eventually swallow up so much that his stomach will be full. Of course, that's not how it works. You wanted more and more and more until people eventually said no. But to look at, historical what ifs, what if the world stepped in to protect Czechoslovakia? Did they have the military capability to do that? Yeah, probably. Germany was certainly weaker before they took Czechoslovakia than after, with the Czech arms industry, of course, being massive. That's several years less time that the German army had to train and refit itself. Could have been done, wasn't. And so Germany became stronger. Just as if Russia can swallow up Ukraine, Russia will be stronger and be able to go after somebody else. And these calls for appeasement continued. There was, of course, the line from that one French newspaper of, why die for Danzig? Of, is Poland really worth French blood in order to protect? Is this really worth a war? Really, we just want peace. But of course, the lesson that we can take from that is the line, why die from Danzig, was not coming from some principled pacifist or anything like that. It came from a fascist, Marcel Diet, who became a Vichy collaborator. Pacifism and appeasement are often just the more socially acceptable way to express pro-war sentiments. And oh boy, do we see that again and again and again. We have these pro-Russian propagandists not coming out and directly saying that they support Russia's war, but really just want peace, why can't you just talk and give everything that Russia wants? It's not our problem. Everything repeats. But within those years, from 1939 to 1944, what occurred was an apocalypse. And within the story of World War II, which is often told either in the scale of grand battle or the tragedies of specific peoples or the sheer scale of the death, what often sits with me more than that is what comes after. What happens after the apocalypse? For some peoples more than other, this apocalypse was more complete. For the Jews, of course, it was the Holocaust. I feel like I don't need to explain what the Holocaust was. But also the whole ethnic diversity of most of these lands was completely, or near completely, wiped out. Polish culture, which had existed throughout Ukraine for centuries, gone. The Crimean Tatars, of course, were among the many groups that was targeted by Stalin in the immediate aftermath and, of course, last years of World War II for expulsion. Stalin wanted Crimea to be more ethnically Russian because sensitive, strategic, and geographic location, and therefore wanted a loyal population there. And so the Crimean Tatars, on May 18th, 1944, were expelled en masse. This group of people that once ruled over Crimea and much of southern Ukraine, whose culture stitches together the cultures of just about every ethnic group that had come through Crimea for hundreds, thousands, really, of years, gone. And not only the Crimean Tatars, Greeks. If you listen to our history episode, were the start of recorded history in Ukraine in the sense of people writing things down, gone. Armenians, Bulgarians, Italians, expelled, though some were allowed to come back. Not the Crimean Tatars, not until 1988. Other expulsions were reversed, but Crimea, this area that had been so richly cosmopolitan and multicultural, bulldozed over to make way for the Russian world. Germans, of course, faced expulsions as they did throughout Eastern Europe. All this wiped out. And if you listen to the family histories of any Ukrainian, even if, of course, the Ukrainian nation very much stayed here despite the Holodomor and other horrific things that happened in the early 20th century, the stories that everyone has to tell are the stuff that can chill your bones, of people being taken to Germany for slave labor, of the great uncle who was suspected of collaboration but really is just a case of their neighbor who wanted their house, and so called the secret police on them, of anti-Soviet resistance fighters who held out in the western parts of Ukraine through the 1950s of people who don't have very large extended families because they're all shot. I think of course, of my one friend whose grandmother lost her entire family to the Nazis as all Jews in the area were rounded up and executed. And while she eventually came back to Ukraine after going to Central Asia throughout the course of the war as a refugee, never went back to that town. But that town, as she knew it, no longer existed. What good is the river and the grass and the trees if all the people are no longer there? That's what I mean by an apocalypse. But nobody was really allowed to work through what that meant. Stalin, of course, was still around, and his repressions would continue on into his death in the mid-1950s. There was no elective catharsis there. People just had to move on. And for my other polemic, I suppose, I have to think of what that means for the current war. Donbass is in ruin. I know plenty of people who come from Donbass, and there's no going home for them. Even if the war is won and everything is taken back and there's peace and security, physically, in some cases, you can't go back. It's too heavily mined. It's too destroyed. Can anyone even afford to rebuild which is already gone? Can Bakhmut be a city again? I don't know. But even if it is, it won't be the same people. There can be a Mariupol again, maybe. But to go back to Mariupol with your friends and your family dead, is it the same Mariupol? No, it's an apocalypse. And you're a survivor of the apocalypse. One benefit I feel for today's post-apocalyptic survivors is that we're a bit more advanced when it comes to the idea of historical memory than the Soviet Union was. That's certainly true. There have already been efforts to get people to think through these things, to meet with other people from the same locations. There's gatherings of survivors of Mariupol. The Ukrainian intelligentsia is certainly working out the collective emotions of the nation in a way. That did not happen after the Second World War, and that stunted remembrance festered for decades, leading in part to this war. Of course, in the immediate aftermath of the victory in World War II, Stalin was cautious about celebrating the Red Army too much, because if people celebrated the Red Army too much, that was an outside source of power that was a threat to him. Marshal Gregory Zhukov, who was often associated with the Red Army's victory in that war, was certainly too well liked to get rid of entirely, but pushed aside. During the course of the Soviet Union, there was only a small handful of remembrances for the victory in World War II. The big holiday of the year was rather for the anniversary of the October Revolution, and of course the May holidays as well, with May Day. But it was mostly October. And the commemoration of the victory, I think it was like 3 or 4 times that anything really happened. But coming out of the Soviet Union into the 90s, there was the question of, what are we now? In the early days of the Soviet Union, of course, people could look towards the revolution. They could look towards the utopia of communism that they were building towards, something that had largely died out by the 70s, ossified into a form of conservatism that, interestingly enough, when people look back and say they miss the Soviet Union, they're referring more to this 1970s, 1980s conservative, kind of gave up on the revolution kind of Soviet Union, rather than the Soviet Union of Lenin. But without any of that, now what? What is the mission? What is the identity? And for Russia, anyway, that became World War II. What is it that everyone can be proud of? The victory in World War II. What can our grandparents tell us stories about? Well, not anymore, but back in the 90s. Tragically, that time period is quickly coming to a close where you could hear stories directly from the people who were there, but they can say how their grandparents were there for the storming of Berlin. And so the national idea of Russia became closely entangled with victory in World War II. And so we see where that stunted myth became the nationalist cult that led to the current war. Russia the saviors, Russia the defeaters of fascism. That was their one thing. Some wanted a repeat of that one thing. And so this Putinist nationalist idea became closer and closer enmeshed with the idea of World War II. Some of the aggressive actions taken by Russia leading up to this invasion were connected to their mythological identity of World War II. look back to when in 2007, when Russia was supposed to be friendly, launched a cyber attack bringing down the internet infrastructure of Estonia. Why? Because Estonia had moved a Soviet Red Army statue away from a central location to a more secondary one. And this infuriated the Russians so much that they launched the cyber attack. Then, with the real tipping point of Putinism in 2012, with a mass protest action against Putin coming back into power. Well, he never left power, but returning to the presidency from his brief exile as prime minister when, interestingly, the prime minister became a much more important position. But anyway, this do or die moment when Russian civil society tried and failed to prevent this consolidation of power. How did Putin counteract this protest movement? By trying to gin up nationalism. And the way he did that was through the Immortal Regiment. The Immortal Regiment for Victory Day, the anniversary of the victory in World War II, when a bunch of people walk around with pictures of their family who had served in the Red Army. On the surface, this seems pretty mundane. People respecting their family members, their grandparents, who oftentimes gave their lives in the defense of their country. It's a noble thing. But that's an excellent disguise, isn't it? The thing that you cannot criticize directly, that if you're the guy standing aside and pointing out that this march might be nefarious, you're the one who looks more suspicious. But it was nefarious. Well, it wasn't originally. The founders of the Immortal Regiment movement in 2011, very recent, they kind of regret allowing this event to become so politicized because they had only wanted it for remembrance purposes, but it was immediately, within a year, weaponized by the Putinist system in order to get people's nationalist feelings built up so they could turn away what could have been the last possible moment to save Russia. And it was done through World War II remembrance in the stunted, cultic way that it is treated. That was never allowed to work itself out in healthy ways. What I'm saying is maybe sometimes entire countries can go to therapy. And so every year since then, the Immortal Regiment has been a direct Russian op in Germany or wherever else it may be, a show of force by Russian imperialists, wherever they may be, where they're flying the Russian flag, sometimes flying the Russian imperial flag for some reason. What does that have to do with World War II? And it is now entirely about Russian ultranationalism. But again, because it looks like just commemoration of World War II, when a Ukrainian shows up to these things and says, hey, this is a pro-war rally, it's sometimes hard to convince others that that is the case. But what has gone on in Ukraine with World War II remembrance? This is something that has become one of the main things that Ukraine has been criticized for by the international community, sometimes in good faith, often very much in bad faith, because the Ukrainian experience was split. Because yes, the Nazis were bad. Bold statement, I know. It is good. It is 100% objectively good that Nazi Germany was defeated. And it is objectively good that Ukrainians played a key role in that. Ukrainians, after the Belarusians, suffered the highest cost for defeating Nazi Germany in all of Europe. But also, conversely, the Soviet Union was also not good. I'd say not as bad as literally Hitler, but also, is that really the standard that we want to be holding things up to? Not Hitler. The Soviet Union had done the Holodomor. It had done all these expulsions and killings that I had already listed. It was an awful place that became slightly less awful as time went on. But Ukrainians went through so much effort to gain their independence and freedom that for many, celebrating it as a Soviet victory is complicated feelings. And of course, there were those who were trying for an independent Ukraine at that time and chose bad allies to do so, and often had very bad ideas as a part of doing that. I'm not a fan of Stepan Bandera. He was not a chill dude. UPA did kill a lot of people. So no, neither of these options are very good. But the core idea of wanting Ukrainian independence was good, so lots of stuff going on there. And that's something that modern Ukraine has had to work through. And it has been complicated, and there's plenty of things to talk about that go far more than what I can cover even in my little recap rant here. But really, that's something Ukrainians have to work through. It's a choice Ukrainians have to make. The one interesting part of early Zelensky was trying to reconcile these ideas by having a Red Army veteran meet with an UPA veteran and shake hands and be like, this is our past, but together we're building a future Ukraine. These two very old men who at one point would have murdered each other. It was a good symbolic thing, and it kind of was emblematic of Zelensky-ist, I suppose we can say, attitudes towards historical memory and national healing and that kind of thing. But again, that's Ukrainian process and not one that others can impose upon. And when others impose upon it, it just causes distortions. And now, how much of that conversation would happen when the Russians, as a part of their war propaganda, are trying to just frame all Ukrainians as Nazis and therefore have to be defeated just like the Nazis were. That is quite obviously and plainly rubbish. I mean, I'm a Jewish leftist. I would have noticed. And in fact, I'll discuss this and more Jewish things. The era of post-Maidan Ukraine, if anything, has been a bloom in Jewish culture and acceptance, in the ideas of liberalism and European unity, and all those things are currently the national idea of Ukraine. Not something that Nazis like very much, whereas the Russian ideals of authoritarianism and ethnic revanchism, that's a bit more familiar. But everything to say about Russia in this regard is, I don't know, pretty straightforward. All of their current claims are bogus. It is all just nasty, fascistic propaganda on their part to justify murder, but they're not the only ones who are painting Ukraine in this light. Mixed metaphor there, but I'll leave it in. You always hear about Western Europeans, especially Americans, also repeating the whole Ukrainians equals Nazi things. And yes, there is the simplistic explanation for this, which they just generally support Russia in this war and are just attaching themselves to any particular propaganda point that is raised without too much reflection on what they're saying. A lot of it is hidden behind different motives, a million different reasons for why different people want Ukraine to be crushed and destroyed. And the words they choose are mostly arbitrary. But even in these cases where people pick up on hollow, argumentative points, you do have to take it seriously in some way. And I think I figured out some of this why. There was Nazi collaboration all over Europe and well beyond Europe. India, Southeast Asia, Japan, of course, but it's very rare for these countries that did have direct pro-German governments. Vichy France, Italy, Spain. Kudos to Denmark, the country that was able to evacuate its small Jewish population before being overrun. But Nazi collaboration was much more official everywhere besides Ukraine. There was a France with a French government supported by a French bureaucracy and a French army that was allied with Nazi Germany. Ukraine had a short-lived insurgency movement that was quickly abandoned and purged. The scale of these two things is very different. So why is France and Italy and Netherlands and Belgium and all these places, Slovakia, why are they, Romania, where I am now, why are they not getting the same level of stereotypes and criticism? And going back to this idea of Ukraine and Russia having a stunted ability to move on past World War II, they are the only ones. Everyone is still living with the scars on their soul that came from the Second World War. And a lot of this is frankly displacement of guilt. Was your grandpa in the resistance? Statistically, probably not. Statistically, he was probably a shopkeeper paying his taxes and getting by, and more often than many would admit throughout the continent, ready to turn over their Jewish neighbor in order to steal his property. Nobody has found a good way to deal with these facts, to deal with the scars of this history. Even Germany, we can say that Germany is supposed to be the gold standard in working through the sins of its past. But, well, for one, you never hear about the German genocides in Africa, in Namibia, the Ruhr. So that is clearly not a part of that process. And now a new Nazi party has gained significant ground in Germany. The AfD. So maybe the Germans haven't fully worked through that. These far-right parties are sprouting up all over Europe in far larger quantities and far larger impact than they ever have in Ukraine, and often with Russian funding, by the way. Now, what they could do in all these countries is to have a continuous reckoning with what everyone was doing during the Second World War, or they can make Ukraine the scapegoat, make Ukraine the sin eater. Ukrainians, Balts, you're the ones who collaborated with the Nazis, and let all of our collective repressed guilt be placed on you. Let you deal with it. And so after placing all of the continent's sins on Ukraine, that scapegoat can be sent out into the wilderness and devoured by the demon Azazel, taking with it all those sins with him. Now, there's a reason why this practice existed in the Bible. The offloading of sin, the clearing of consciousness. A version of this ritual exists throughout many societies, the sacral king, but those are rituals. Those are mostly symbolic, and instead it's being done to tens of millions of people. Allow that Ukrainian child to be crushed by a missile, and maybe I don't have to think about all the other stuff anymore, because they're the Nazis, no longer me, all on them. But maybe if we all had more of a reckoning with World War II, more of a holistic approach for everyone to air out their crowded memories, maybe none of this would have happened. If we all could have collectively exorcised our ghosts, we wouldn't have a haunting. But we didn't, so here we are. But what has changed recently with this remembrance of World War II? And this year, a few things really stuck out to me. On Victory Day, May 8th, in Ukraine, May 9th in Russia, the time zone difference in most of Europe, it was the 8th, but in Moscow time, it was the 9th. It's not so complicated more than that. But typically speaking, in the past, the story of the victory in World War II was that Russia, together with the other Soviet peoples, including Ukrainians, though with the Russians, of course, playing the most important role, were able to defeat Nazi Germany. But it was a moment where all the Soviet peoples held hands to complete this task. And the problem with Ukraine, you see, was they had just forgotten the lessons of their grandparents and turned on their legacy and betrayed who they are. That was always how Russia usually treated it, and certainly this year that was part of it as well. But much more commonly this year was the complete eclipse of the entire World War II story as solely Russian. This had always been a problem, of course, of certainly Americans and Western Europeans and others associating the victories in World War II with Russia and not the entirety of the Soviet Union, including Ukraine. But it was more pronounced this time around. Listening to a lot of the Russian propaganda media, the Ukrainians were always the enemy, always the Nazis. That during World War II, the entirety of Ukrainians were on the side of Germany. And the role they played in defeating Nazi Germany was expunged. Again, not entirely, but much more extensively than in the past. And this has mimicked a lot of the Russian rhetoric about the war. At the beginning, it was about extending their hands out to their Ukrainian little Russian fellows who were truly in their hearts bound to Russia in a spiritual sense. And it's really just these outsiders, these Westerners, these Jews who were dividing the Slavic peoples from each other. That has withered away with time to more and more of the Ukrainians as a whole, if they're even willing to use that word, are degenerate, evil Satan worshippers that have to be exterminated. That the assimilation has to be more extensive, that Ukrainians as a whole are the enemy and not just this upper echelon of Western collaborators, as they used to say. And as I was saying, that transition became much more extreme with this Victory Day of so entirely representing the victory in World War II as Russians specifically against Germany along with Ukrainians rather than Russia and Ukraine against the Nazis. And I wouldn't say that's worrying. We all know where this has gone the entire time. But it does show how they're more and more willing to kind of drop the act, to stop pretending like they're doing something altruistic, and just kind of embracing being the villain. And of course, for the Victory Day parade, it was taken as an opportunity by Russia to show off the countries that they could count on, who were a part of their bloc. And while that wasn't fully the case, parts of the people who were there have, in a much more real sense, have broken away from that bloc. I'm thinking primarily of Armenia, but the presence of China, the presence of North Korea, Venezuela. It was supposed to be a show of who is on Russia's side for this war, and nothing really to do about the past war, but about this one. And so past, present, and future all collapsed in on each other in this show of military force. In Italian fascism, there's the concept of the man of the eternal present that has spread out into all other forms of fascist ideologies. But the observations made on this eternal present is that the past doesn't really exist as the past. It's only instrumental for how it's worked to your current needs. All conceptions of time collapse to serve the immediate moment. And that's kind of how I felt when I saw this parade. As a historical remembrance is entirely incoherent. A statement of the present. This is our war. This is all we exist to be and all we will ever be. And all we ever have been is this war that is the modern fascism. And, of course, there's so much more to rant about. Second World War was seminally important in so many ways. I took quite a few moments throughout this to really perhaps get overthinking about things, but hey, it's a podcast. Dudes pontificating is what this is all about. But thanks for listening. And this is really an episode where I kind of want to hear back from you. So it kind of feels to make this a fundraising thing, but our Patreon is the best way to do it. And if you have any reflections, the Second World War still lingers in your life of what it had to do with your family, any thoughts, that you may have about this. This is really something that I feel is a communal type of experience, a communal type of thing that we should be working through. And in our own way, I hope I can open up a topic that people are, especially in Ukraine, you kind of have to cry out at people sometimes. If we can have this collective discussion in a healthier way, I very much invite you to do that. So on our Patreon, patreon.com/Ukraine Without Hype, on our Discord, which you can join after joining up with that, I very much welcome any of your thoughts you may have about this. And to close off this episode, to thank all of our community members that we already have, all of our wonderful Patreon subscribers who make what this is possible. I'm very much waiting to hear anything you have to reflect upon, anything you have to get off your chest even about these things. Please don't hold back. But thank you all very much for your support through all this. You have what make this all possible. Hey, thank you for that. So thank you very much to Deborah Grazer, Randy McNerlin. The voices in my head are from Big Pharma, Arminius, David Shepard, Giorgio, Ivana Kukratskaya, Kathy and Brent Irvine, Michael Drucker, Mike, PLM, Anonymous, Barbara, Dennis Napalm, Devi, Dimitri Litvin, Elizabeth Hughes, James Burke, Inara, Jenny Louise, Kevin Alberton, Kyle Smith, Marguerite, Megan, Michael Wickman, Nick, Niazan, Silas Frank, T. Bart, Vivek, Abel Lenz, Ada McDonald, Alex Grochwell, Anastasia, Andrew Glenn, Can Dystopian Fiction Please Remain Fiction, Captain Technical, Chris Bennington, Christopher Yee, Dan, David Wall, Demetrio, Dana Jones, Dish Taco, Emily Pavona, Etienne Soleil, Evelyn, Francois, Grace Krause, Had to Laugh, Jacob Holm, James Wise, Jared Bradley, Joseph Verlone, Jared, Julia Lindsay, Justin Devendorf, Justin R., Kick Acetron, Kiwi Valley, Kyle Johnson, Laura De Leon, Lori Halila, Lemoninkin, Lenny Grove, Marianne Ebbs, Matt Miller, Melissa Kaselko, Anonymous, Noah Brown, Noam Hart, RDK, Sanjay, Scott Burry, Scott Trokyuk, Stuart Akers, Subtle Knife, Ursula Zolenkoff, Veronica, Victor Mate, William Brown, Yellow Duck, Zay Perry, and Marcus Naskus. Again, thank you all very much. You what make this all possible. And until next time, Slava Ukraini.